Welcome back to Chapter 6. Alexander Ian Dunkirk decided he needed to think outside the box, and he did his best thinking on the run, which meant jogging. He usually jogged the night before an exam, right before he began a cramming session, but now he had a different dilemma to resolve. Windy. And after a restless night, he decided to hit the streets of Wendale, leaving the familiar campus far behind. Once he had jogged beyond the campus buildings into the heart of the town, he began to see its age. Wendale was a town over 300 years old, and it showed its age in more ways than the number of historical monument plaques. The town had died a little death with the collapse of the textile industry. It had revived the town's history of witchcraft in hopes of generating tourist dollars, but the truth was that Wendale's potential as a tourist stop was severely overestimated by the Chamber of Commerce, despite the proliferation of quaint street names. His weak economic prognosis for the town was getting him nowhere, and, he suspected, was merely a way of helping him avoid the issue. Alex had screwed up with Wendy, and maybe there wasn't anything he could do to make things right again. Sometimes mistakes are unintentional, only obvious with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight. His mistakes had been obvious every step of the way. He should have known better from the start. Wendy had smashed his attempted clean slate across her knees and sent him packing. So what's next? The main problem wasn't even her sense of modesty. At first, he thought that embarrassment might be the source of her anger, but soon realized it was more than that. She had opened up to him, brought him into her emotional circle, so to speak, and by spying on her, he had shown himself unworthy of her trust. It didn't really matter what she had done in private or how she had been dressed or undressed while doing it. The sticking point was that it had been a private thing. You can't unring a bell, he thought. Maybe time was the only thing that would help her get past his betrayal, if she ever did. If not, Wendy Ward would likely be one of the greatest regrets in his life, and that was something that really made his insides ache. I can't give up on this, he decided. She's not ditching me that easily. He slipped on something slick in the road. For an instant he hung poised on the treacherous line between maintaining his balance and the fall. Then he pitched backward, arms swinging in slapstick circles. He knew before he hit that he was going to be hurt. When the pain came, it seemed to be registered by a different sense, a texture and a thudding pressure, a rusty color, a sound like a mallet striking a faraway drum. Then it hurt. He landed on his ass in the sticky, slick mess that had caused him to slip, his head whipping back a split second later, smacking the blacktop. After a dazed moment, he rolled up onto his hands and knees, the dark mess squeezing between his fingers. As he tried to push himself up, his palms shot out in front of him, and he fell face first, his nostrils filled with the nauseating stench. An explosion of gore covering the entire width of the road. It smeared his clothing, had soaked through his sweatpants, plastering a clammy swatch against his thighs. He felt it drying on his face. He wanted to scream, but the running and the sudden fall had startled any sound out of him. A dozen feet away, the carnage seemed heaviest, a dark heap. He saw bits of spotted hide, shreds the size of wash rags, a jagged fence of splintered ribs. A long skull trailed vertebrae and ruptured muscles, the snout crushed in blunty. A lolling tongue. A cow, Alex thought, part of his mind still screaming irrationally that he'd wandered into the human wreckage of an automobile accident. But no, a cow. It was just a cow. He wiped the gory mess from his hands on the cement road, leaving long crimson smears. Bad luck and some ridiculous need for self-flagellation had caused him to stumble right into this, granddaddy of all roadkill. The cow must have wandered free of its pasture, been hit by what? Nothing short of a Mack truck could have done this much damage to an animal, and a large truck seemed unlikely on this small road. Maybe another prank by some of the more inventive frat members. Tired of simply tipping or spray painting the cows, they had decided to use them as four-legged tenpins. But where was the car? Where was the fucking wreck? They would have totaled the car after striking a heifer that violently. The cow had literally exploded. Alex wondered, belatedly, if some explosive device had been concocted in Danfield's chemistry lab, but that too seemed far-fetched. What the hell had happened to this cow? It wasn't until 20 minutes later, the sleepy police on the scene and Alex's bloody clothes stinking in the early morning sunlight, that Alex thought of another possibility. He climbed a short distance up a hillside and looked down at what seemed like an evenly distributed blast radius. He tipped his head back and watched a carrion bird wheeling slow figure eights high above. The cow hadn't been struck. It had been dropped. Once breakfast in the physician's cafeteria, over breakfast in the physician's cafeteria, Dr. Jim Phelan called up to the 8th floor on a cell phone and spoke to the posting clerk. I'd like to schedule an add-on surgery for today. Patient is named Leeson, Arthur A., Phelan said. Born 12/14/59, room 712. I need to get him on a table this morning. So he's class 2? The clerk asked, and when Phelan confirmed the priority status, said, What's the procedure? Phelan dictated slowly. He knew the clerk was writing it down. Excision of necrotic right eye with exploration and debridement of rectus and oblique muscles, optic nerve, retinal artery, and vein. Got that? The clerk grunted. Phelan added, Oh, and Dr. Ganjemi will be assisting. The clerk said, We'll page you when we've scheduled an OR. Phelan closed the cell phone just as 3 of his colleagues entered the doctor's cafeteria deep in solemn consultation. Howard Sanders and Richard Green were well-respected oncologists. Kea Kyathian was the hospital's chief pediatric resident. Phelan picked up his styrofoam cup of coffee and approached the men. He knew Kyathian was attending on Abby McNeil. How's your girl? He asked. Kyathian was post-call and his bloodshot eyes showed it. Not good. She tried to crump on us last night, spiked a high fever around midnight, and followed it with a nice febrile seizure. Christ. Tell me about it. We finally got her defervesced by 1, but it was scary there for a while. He yawned, shuddering with exhaustion. Any luck identifying the infectious agent yet? Kyathian tipped his head toward the oncologists. We were just talking. We're pushing all kinds of antibiotics, but she's not responding. So we're looking at some other possibilities. Like? Richard Green answered for the resident. Her CBC this morning shows pancytopenia and lymphoblasts, so we're scheduling a bone marrow biopsy. You think she has leukemia? Phelan said with surprise. Green shrugged. We're throwing darts at this point. There's something radical going on inside this poor kid. Sanders sipped his coffee, judged it too hot, and asked, How about your guy? I'm going back in today to remove the eye. I'm treating the infection as if it's orbital cellulitis. I've got to get it before it infects the brain. Phelan's pager went off and he checked its readout. That's the OR. Gotta run. He finished the dregs of his coffee and dropped the cup in the trash on his way out. Jimmy, Howie Sanders called after Phelan, do me a favor while you've got your guy under General. What's that? Give him a double orchiectomy for me. Phelan nodded, flashed a tired smile, and left. Orchiectomy, from the Greek root word for testicle. While Abby was undergoing a bone marrow biopsy, a painful procedure that in the little girl's sad condition could be performed without lidocaine, Art was waiting for surgery. Sheriff Bill Nottingham had paid another unwelcome visit only moments before, informing Art that he would be transported to the Gander Hill Adult Correctional Facility as soon as his doctors deemed him fit enough to travel, and assuming Art hadn't by that time managed to post the $250,000 bail set by Essex County Judge William Big Mac McLaughlin. A former beat cop from Boston's combat zone, McLaughlin was notorious for expediting criminal cases in his courtroom and handing down severe McSentences faster than a drive-through window. $250,000, Art said, despite the pre-op sedative and RN had just injected it into his IV. As the drug began to ripple over him, he watched himself as if from a great distance reach out to clutch the sheriff's coat sleeve. "Please, Bill, you've got to stop this," he said. "I didn't touch her." It occurred to Art, even through his druggy fog, that it was in the extremes of experience that melodrama lived, and that arriving there, unrehearsed and frightened, we only had cliches to grasp. "I'm innocent. You've got the wrong guy." The sheriff had forcibly removed Art's clutching hand from his sleeve and was about to cuff him to the bed rail when he was scolded by a passing RN. "Do you honestly think this patient is in any shape to be a threat to someone?" The sheriff frowned and returned the handcuffs to their place on his belt. Now, 20 minutes later, Art was shifted onto a gurney and wheeled down the long corridors toward the waiting elevators that would transport him to the OR on the 8th floor. He felt a flutter of panic awaken deep beneath the sedation, like something small struggling for breath. "My eye," he thought, giving into that panic. "They're going to take my eye." He'd signed the consent forms, but it hadn't seemed as real and final then as it did now. And after they took his eye, they were going to send him to prison, where the real sexual predators would cruise the shallows that, for Art, had been forever reduced to two dimensions. By the time they reached the 8th floor, Art's panic had slipped the velvet restraints of sedation. The orderly left Art momentarily on his gurney in the corridor while he went in search of the nurse manager in charge of prep and holding. Art scanned the corridor, saw stainless steel refrigerators labeled pathology samples, a waiting crash cart, a tall shelving rack stocked with surgical scrubs, small, medium, large, extra large. He rolled off the gurney, winced as he tugged the IV out of his arm. He didn't yet have a plan, but he was in motion. He snatched medium scrubs from the shelves and began running. In the stairwell, he slipped out of his hospital gown and stood naked for several tense moments as he struggled to fit his clumsy limbs into the blue scrubs. Then he began descending quickly, the concrete fire stairs chilly beneath his paper booties. He just made it to the 6th floor landing when he heard the overhead page echo through the stairwell. "Security to the 8th floor. Stat. Code orange." Sheriff Nottingham was on his way out of the building through the ER when he heard security paged overhead and saw two guards run past him toward the elevators. 8th floor, surgery. He stopped at an admitting desk, asked the triage nurse, "What's the code orange?" "Lost patient," the nurse said. "Means someone who shouldn't has just went ambulatory." The sheriff began running in the direction of the west stairwell. "What the fuck are you doing?" Art paused on the 4th floor landing, saying aloud what the little voice of reason had been shouting at him since the moment he'd gotten off the gurney. He wasn't sure why he was running or where he intended to go, but he knew he had to get out of this hospital and off this runaway train headed toward prison and disfigurement. 4th floor. They'd mobilized the security pretty quickly, so he knew there would be guards covering the main exits from the building. He'd have to find an alternate route out. 4th floor. He hesitated on the landing, staring at the number stenciled on the steel fire door. His pulse throbbed in his ruined eye behind the bandages. 4th floor. And then a piece of memory fell on him. The pediatric intensive care. Abby's floor. Shit, no time. And yet he knew he had to take this detour to see her. Without knowing what exactly he intended to say when he found the little girl, he pulled open the fire door and dashed onto the PICU. He hoped his surgical scrubs would buy him a few moments unnoticed among the staff. Whoa, the bandages. With his head still swaddled in gauze, he might as well be wearing a sign that read, "Baby Rapist." He ducked into a men's room and began tearing the bandages free, bracing himself for the horror he expected to see in the mirror. He was surprised to find most of the bruising had faded and the minor lacerations on his cheeks healed. If he kept his head down and moved quickly, he might slip by. He exited the rest room and walked headlong into a security guard. "Watch it," the guard said, and pushed Art aside brusquely as he headed toward the stairwell. Art hugged the wall, told himself to breathe again. He began walking briskly along the carpeted corridor, headed for the PICU. There was only one RN at the nurse's station, and she was too busy trying to clear a paper jam in the printer to notice Art. Room 411, 412, 413, Abby. The sheriff burst through the fire door on 8 to find a half-dozen security guards surrounding an empty gurney. "Get downstairs! Cover the exits!" "Sir?" the nearest guard said. The sheriff didn't bother repeating the instructions, only snatched the man's walkie-talkie from his hip and barked into it. "I need someone watching every exit. Main, ER, outpatient clinic." He threw the walkie-talkie back to the ground, thrust a finger at two of the men. "You and you, with me. We'll sweep one floor at a time. The rest of you get downstairs and lock this place down." He broke the huddle and led the search for the fugitive. The little girl had been left on her side following the biopsy and lay now facing the windows. Art thought she might be sleeping, but when he came around the foot of her bed, he saw her eyes open and staring out at the cloud-streaked sky. He said her name quietly, and the eyes shifted, fixing him with an indifferent gaze. She looked smaller than he remembered, there in the great mechanical hospital bed. One IV dripped a steady flow of antibiotics into her arm, while a second fed her a liquid breakfast directly through a G-tube in her stomach. From beneath her blankets, more tubes carried away her urine to a discreet receptacle. Worst of all was the steel halo that stabilized her head while her vertebrae healed. Art saw the fine surgical screws that fixed the hardware directly to her skull and felt his heart seize within his chest with sorrow. He wondered how much she remembered of the accident, wondered if the gaps in her memory had been filled with the fiction of his supposed kidnapping. And yet she regarded him now with neither recognition nor fear, only that cool, horrible indifference of a sick child heavily medicated. "Abby," he said, and crouched suddenly below the level of the bed as he saw two RNs stride by briskly outside the room. He was very close to the child now, his face close enough to hers that he could feel her breath against his cheeks and smell the ghost of a child beneath the disinfectant. "Sweetheart, you have to try to talk again," he whispered, as if sharing a secret. "You have to try to remember what happened. Tell the police who has been hurting you." She stared at him without blinking. He could see tiny versions of himself reflected in her eyes. "Abby, do you understand?" Nothing. He took her hand in his own, then wished that he hadn't. It was cool and clammy, a lifeless thing. He felt tears come then to his eyes, stinging, and he tipped his head against the chilly bars of the bed railing. "I'm so sorry, Abby," he said miserably. The little girl's mouth twitched involuntarily, he thought, and then she spoke. "Name isn't Abby anymore." Art froze, ice water beneath his skin. He felt her dead hand, impossibly, tighten around his own, seize him in an iron grip. He asked with great care, "What's your name?" To which the little girl answered, "Sarah Hutchins." The elevator doors opened on 4, and the sheriff emerged with the two security guards. The three men moved efficiently, fanning out as they swept through the PICU, checking each room. The RN at the nurse's station looked up from her paper jam as they stormed past. Sheriff Nottingham trotted ahead of the other two as Abby's room came into sight. Nothing. She was alone. Art descended the fire stairs quickly, his paper slippers shushing across the concrete. Above, he heard loud male voices echoing in the stairwell. Where now? Any advantage he'd lost by his detour through the PICU, and was certain now security would be covering all the main exits, except for one. With the sounds of voices growing closer overhead, Art hurried down the stairs past the first floor landing, heading for the basement. Within moments, he was gone. Later, Sheriff Bill Nottingham would replay the events of the morning and try to understand how exactly Art Leeson had managed to slip out of the hospital undetected. True, this wasn't a high-security facility, and the sheriff hadn't had either the time or the manpower to turn it into one. Yet they'd swept each floor methodically and posted men at every service entrance, fire exit, and back door. In other words, at every exit a pedestrian might use to leave the hospital. But Art hadn't left by a pedestrian exit. He'd left via the physician's underground parking garage, where the only guard was a mechanical gate. Thus had he so effortlessly evaded the Wendell Police Department and a team of trained security guards. The sheriff vowed not to give Art a second chance at such evasion. Wendy arrived at Pearson Hall several minutes early for comp lit and immediately regretted it. Frankie spotted her before she could get through the doors to the classroom and hurried over. "I'm not speaking to you," Wendy said in a preemptive verbal strike. "What are you talking about?" Frankie asked, genuinely baffled. Obviously, Alex hadn't clued her in. "I know," Wendy said. "Alex told me." "Again, what are you talking about?" "You told him," Wendy said, then whispered, "about the ceremony in the woods." "Did he show up?" "He followed me." "I thought he would," Frankie said. "Unless I underestimated him, he should have brought some wine and cheese and a selection of soft music." "What are you talking about?" "It's so obvious you guys are hot for each other," Frankie said. "Some people are so dense. I should have known better than to initiate a rapprochement between the sexes. So what happened? He scare you?" "He spied on me." "Yuck, a peeper?" Frankie said. "I'm pissed at you, Frankie," Wendy said. "I told you about my ritual in private, and you told Alex to follow me. I thought you were my friend." Frankie's eyes seemed to refocus. "You're serious, aren't you? You're really mad at me." "Furious. I really liked Alex." "Past tense? It's over now," Wendy said. "We can't go back the way we were. Look, Wendy, obviously I misjudged the situation. I screwed up. Please don't be too quick to throw something away." "Maybe you shouldn't have been so quick to violate a confidence," Wendy said, brushing by her and entering the lecture hall. "Open mouth, insert Birkenstock," Frankie said sullenly. Wendy rolled her eyes when she saw that Alex had saved a seat for her, as if nothing had happened. She climbed the stairs and walked by him without even acknowledging his offer. Alex caught her arm, and she noticed abrasions on his hands, like rope burns or road rash. "Wendy, I need to talk to you," he said. "I'm not feeling very talkative," she said. He forced a grin. "Then I'll do all the talking." "Save your breath," she said, and walked back several rows to the next empty seat. She could feel his gaze on her back, but she ignored his attempts at eye contact then and all during the class. Frankie took the seat Alex had saved for Wendy, and the two of them had a heated exchange before the start of class. Wendy couldn't help watching them, wondering at the dynamic that had managed to split both of them away from her. Frankie's meddling, Alex's unspoken curiosity. Whenever they happened to glance her way, she quickly averted her eyes. She was trying her best to pretend they no longer existed. It would be easier that way. After class, Frankie and Alex made an attempt to approach her. Wendy turned her back on them and cut through one of the back rows, intending to go out the far door to avoid even having to tell them she really didn't want to talk about it, to leave her alone. That's what brought her to Jensen Hoyt's desk near the back of the class. The dark-haired girl had her head bowed over a sketchbook instead of her class notebook, her fingers methodically smudging the pencil illustration, getting the texture and the shadows just right. She seemed lost in the image she was rendering. Her long black hair, which hadn't been washed in a week, formed a curtain in front of her face. Jen seemed to sense somebody standing over her. She looked up, revealing dark circles under her haunted eyes, and the curtain of hair parted from the drawing. Wendy gasped. Jen had drawn the face, the black, leathery face with the wisps of hair and the feral eyes that had stared back at Wendy from her bathroom mirror for the blink of an eye. The memory was an indelible image in Wendy's mind, and obviously Jen shared the nightmare visage. What? Wendy's throat was suddenly dry. What is that? It's hideous, isn't it? Jen said, as if that explained everything. Wendy nodded. Jen looked down at what she had drawn, then back at Wendy. It's all I can see. What's it from? It's the creature, Jen said. The creature that took Jack. Wendy's knees buckled, and she fell into the desk in front of Jen, sitting awkwardly and banging her elbow in the process. Alex and Frankie were watching her from the end of the row of seats, watching but maintaining their distance. They looked at each other, confused. The rush of thoughts numbed Wendy's mind to everything else. Somehow she really must be responsible for Jack's disappearance. Somehow she must have summoned this thing, this creature. It had come to do her bidding, to rid her of Jack, and now it was appearing to her, had come to collect its fee. Her free hand went to her mouth, her teeth biting down on her trembling lower lip. What have I done? My God, what have I done? I have more of them, Jen said. More? Wendy said, thinking, how many of them are there? In my dorm room, Jen said. Show me, Wendy said. As Wendy followed Jen through the cinder block corridors of Bosch Residential Hall, she thought, maybe I'm not really missing anything by living at home. The all-female dorm was a concrete bunker built 25 years ago in that great 1970s architectural tradition of post offices and public middle schools, all improbable angles and windows that wouldn't open. The carpet underfoot was an institutional shade of tangerine, the fluorescent lighting overhead flickered to some subliminal rhythm, and the air had a weird, stale smell of dirty laundry. The closed doors they passed were hung with dry erase message boards, J, you go girl, T, and beware the ball sack, and plastered with male models ripped from the pages of GQ. Through the occasional open door, Wendy glimpsed a dorm decor that was timeless. The Escher prints of stairs going nowhere, the liquor store promotional banners for Bud Light, the stuffed animal menageries. When they arrived at Jen's room at the end of the labyrinth, however, Wendy saw a bare door scarred with bits of Scotch tape. Jen fumbled with the keys and gave Wendy a last dark look that seemed to say, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." But behind that warning look there was another, wounded expression of frightened vulnerability. Wendy could see just how fragile the poor girl had become in these last few weeks, and she'd eroded under the pressure of a community's skepticism. As Jen hesitated with the key in the lock, Wendy understood the psychological risk she was taking bringing Wendy here, exposing herself to yet another devastating session of disbelief. Wendy put a hand on Jen's arm and felt the girl flinch. It's okay, Wendy said quietly. Jen took a breath, and her eyes brightened with tears. Then she pushed the door open. See? She said, raising a listless arm to welcome Wendy into her nightmare. Wendy sucked in a sharp breath at what she saw and stepped inside. It seemed that she'd entered a hall of mirrors where image upon image repeated itself endlessly on all sides. But instead of her reflection, the image she saw reflected back at her in 1,000 charcoal variations was of the creature's feral face. Taped to every open scrap of cinder block wall, taped to bureau and closet doors, taped to chairs and lamps, papering out the daylit windows, scattered across the floors. The room was suffocating in paper, the studio of a schizophrenic. Wendy turned slowly in a circle, taking it all in. It would be easy to go crazy in this room, to join its frightened artist in her compulsion. She turned to find Jen and saw the girl standing quietly in the corner. Her expression changed now to one of passive acceptance of whatever judgment Wendy might bring. A strange little smile quirked the girl's lips, and she stole a furtive glance at Wendy. Do you like them? She asked simply, and for a moment Wendy couldn't decide which was the more horrible sight, the gallery of leering monsters or the lost expression of the artist who'd rendered them. Karen was cramping so badly by noon that she canceled her lunch with Eva Hartman and asked her teaching assistant, Kristen, to lead her afternoon graduate seminar. When she arrived home, she rushed inside and huddled on the toilet in the guest powder room and waited for the pain to subside. There were a few drifting blossoms of fresh blood in the bowl. To quell the nausea, she poured herself a tall ginger ale and applied an ice cube to the webbing between her thumb and forefinger, one of Art's little homeopathic tricks he'd picked up from his Chinese acupuncturist. She couldn't tell if the ice actually had some soothing effect on her stomach, or if the feel of it melting up her sleeve was simply enough for a distraction to take her mind off the nausea. In the living room, she found the answering machine filled with messages, all Paul. Beep! Hi, just wanted to know if you're okay, if you need anything, or okay. Beep! Hi, it's me. Are you screening your calls? Long pause. Guess not. I'd like to talk, but I'm willing to wait until you're ready. Beep! Please just give me a call and let me know you're okay. You don't have to stay on if you aren't ready to talk yet. Beep! Karen, please, we need to... She stabbed the erase button hard and stood listening to the whirring hiss of the tape. She held her finger down on the erase as if she were stubbing out an errant spark, an ember of longing for Paul she wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. It had been 3 days since she'd last seen Paul, and in that time she'd withdrawn as well from colleagues and students and retreated to this nest of misery she was building. This was not depression, she told herself, but rather a kind of horrible patience. She was waiting for her baby to die, waiting for the child inside her to finally succumb to its birthright infirmities. Paul couldn't understand what she was suffering. He was a man, and with a man's self-protective instinct for blamelessness. Already she could hear it in his voice, this note of sad acceptance. Already he was distancing himself from the raw immediacy of their loss. In his mind they were simple victims. If he'd been here he would grieve with her, yes, and comfort her, and hold her hand, but he would also mistake what she was feeling for simple depression, some female analog to his own emotion. But she didn't feel depressed. She felt complicit. After all, who else was to blame if not her for bequeathing these crippled genes to her baby? Her baby. Oh, God, my baby. In the basement below, something suddenly went thud. She felt the sound through the soles of her feet as much as heard it. She turned sharply. Had it just been the sound of some precariously stacked junk, the milk crates of old clothing, the ice cream makers she'd bought at a garage sale but never got around to using, shifting in the cluttered basement, or something else? Silence. She felt her heart's adagio flutter settle into a gentler rhythm. Curiosity. She wasn't afraid. The house was flooded with late afternoon daylight. It was too bright for fear. She walked to the top of the cellar stairs and flicked on the light switch. The bulb brightened momentarily and then went nova, its filament exploding with a muffled pop. Shit! With a sigh, she stared down the rickety stairs. At the bottom of the stairs, she peered out into the dark. Paul had strung a second simple light fixture midway around the basement's bend. She could just see it dangling from the open floor joists above. Around her, a lifetime's clutter crouched in shadow, smoldering, making its own dust. She strode across the darkness to the light fixture and pulled the dangling chain. Nothing. Then she noticed the bulb had been smashed. Something shifted from among the shadows, and Karen spun, giving a small cry of surprise. Movement. A face. Don't be frightened, Art said. It's just me. He peered out from the dark place between the furnace and wall where he'd been huddled. Christ, Art, what the hell are you doing here? He emerged clumsily from his hiding place, kicking over a tinkling box of Christmas ornaments in the process. He was wearing blue surgical scrubs, grimy with soot and grease. I didn't know where else to go. I had to break the padlock to get in. I'm sorry, but I couldn't go home. And I couldn't go to Paul's. They'd find me there. Who? The police, Art said. Haven't you heard the helicopters all afternoon? I'm a fugitive from the law. He gave a rueful smile at the ridiculousness of the notion. She was staring down at his feet, trying to decide what sort of footwear the sodden, muddy masses had been once. Hospital booties, he explained. Not exactly all-weather gear. My God, are you okay? The maternal instincts were kicking in, and she led him closer to the dingy light cast by the basement's one high window. I didn't know where to go. I wasn't strong enough to get on a bus out of town, and I didn't know if I could trust Paul. Karen gave Art a critical look. That's not very fair to your brother. You know he'd never turn you in. No, but he'd try to talk me into turning myself in. And you think I won't? Doubt flickered briefly across his face. I hope not. Art, this is crazy. He hushed her with a raised hand, cocking his head at a sound only he heard. She listened, and then she heard it too. The distant noise of a helicopter. It's them, he said in a whisper. The cops have infrared cameras and scopes, you know. Light like night predators. They can see right through rooftops. I don't think they can penetrate to the basement, though. Karen felt the hairs on the back of her neck prickle. Art seemed unaware of how hard he was squeezing her arm, or the fact that he was hurting her. He made her wait until the sound of the helicopter had faded to his satisfaction before speaking, and in that time of tense silence she studied his face. Gaunt, muscles twitching involuntarily on the injured side. She wondered about the state of the mind behind that haggard mask, and when he let her speak again, her first words were trembling, filled with pity for them both. Oh, Art, what the fuck has happened to the two of us? I have a theory about that, Art said suddenly. He sat on some nearby boxes and pulled her down into a conspiratorial huddle. Okay, I've been working on this all day. He took her hands in his own and announced with great certainty, This town is cursed. He squeezed her hands hard, as if to distract her from the disbelief and confusion that followed like a reflex. She winced. Cursed? Or poisoned? Take your pick. He touched his cheek, then extended a hand to touch her belly gently. I guess poisoned is the more accurate word in our case. Art, I don't understand what you're... The birth defects. This mysterious infection I've picked up. Think about it. You know, I came across an interesting statistic once years ago when I was researching my original dissertation. At the turn of the century, the infant mortality rate among residents of Wendell exceeded the national average by 40%, especially among the textile workers. She shook her head. Art, you're not making any sense. What does this have to do with a curse? He grew excited. That's the really cool part. See, it's like Jung's model of the collective unconscious, but with a Marxist spin. Flashback to the 19th century. No one in the community dares voice the suspicion that Wendell's flagship industry is polluting the groundwater and poisoning their young. That'd be heresy. So, and here's where we add a dash of Freud to the mix. We repressed as a community our collective guilt. But see, that kind of guilt can't stay bottled up forever, so it starts to bubble up to the surface again in interesting ways through local folklore, particularly in a backwater little hamlet already predisposed to all things spooky. Presto, instant curse. Compound it with the usual centennial hysteria, and suddenly you have an explanation for everything and anything bad that happened in Wendell circa 1899. And now in 1999, livestock dying? It's the curse. Kids born with flippers? It's the curse. A mill fire kills 38 workers? It's the curse. But I've never heard anything about a curse, and I grew up here. Ah, exactly. See, ever since the textile mills closed, we've forgotten the reason we invented the curse in the first place. But in fact, the real curse is alive and well. You and me and that poor little girl are the latest living chapters in its story. Hell, the water table in this town must have saturated with whatever toxic shit those mills were pumping out in the pre-EPA days. I'd like to go back out to that witch's graveyard with a couple biochemists and a contamination suit. Karen grew frustrated at his paranoid logic. What does this have to do with the witches' graves? That's the poetic justice of it all. Think about it. What are Wendell's witches but another example of our community's willingness to repress its guilt? We're so fucked up that we take our deepest sins and turn them into a parade. Hey, close down Main and invite the neighbors. That's why it's so beautifully ironic that both pasts intersect at that graveyard. It all comes together in a single perfect image of a little girl asleep on a toxin-soaked grave. His excitement turned with alarming speed to urgency. "Do you still have your laptop? Because I'd like to capture some of this." Karen looked at him sadly. "Art, I think you've got more immediate problems to worry about." Overhead, they could hear the choppers circling back again as the manhunt continued. In that light, he suddenly resembled a disappointed child. "You think I'm nuts, don't you?" he said quietly. "I think you're tired," she said, reaching out to brush a wisp of hair that had escaped his ponytail. "And frightened and sick," she said, feeling his brow for fever. He was cool. "I think we've got to talk about how you're going to turn yourself back into the police so you can get back to the hospital." "Please," Art said, and the mad light was gone now from his eyes, replaced by desperation. "Just let me rest here a day or two until I sort this out. I really think I'm onto something." "Why, Art? Why is this so important? What do you think you're going to prove?" "That I'm not the town monster," he said. "That I had reasons for being in those woods other than hurting that little girl." Karen was overwhelmed with a sudden stab of emotion and reached to touch Art's cheek tenderly. "Please," he said, and she knew she couldn't deny him that simple thing he was asking. Christopher Perry never waited long for a ride. He'd learned years ago how to tug at the sympathetic heartstrings of the typical motorist. Came down to the 3 Ps: preparation, presentation, and poise. If you wanted to be a successful American hitchhiker, you had to follow a few simple rules. How you looked was important. That's all you had at the outset. Jeans, the distressed denim variety, were fine, showed a practical side, a little needy. Top it off with a college sweatshirt. He wore Florida Gators colors at the moment because he was headed south for the winter. Higher education was respectable. Keep the hair trim on the sides for the grannies, long in the back for their granddaughters. Try to shave at least every other day. With his blonde hair, twice weekly was enough. Most important of all, you had to look harmless, whether you were or not. He carried a decent-sized switchblade inside his right boot. His look had been good enough to get him some manual work with that general contractor, Paul Leeson. Nice guy, but the town was basically dead. Too depressing acting the townie here. Wouldn't have stuck around as long as he had if not for the chance at some college co-ed action. But he'd grown tired of chasing and working to impress the pretentious bitches. The hell with them. The hell with the crummy under-the-table job. And the hell with Wendell. Time to hit the road again. Time to get back in the groove of catching the perfect free ride. Now he found himself standing with his back to a brutally cold New England wind, thumb freezing in a light rain, with nobody to blame but himself. In this shit little burg called Wendell, Windburn was more like it, nobody seemed to give a sweet damn if a poor but engagingly handsome college student walked through the night till he froze his tight little ass off. 11:30, he'd already given up on the carload of restless co-ed's fantasy. He would have settled for a toothless granny on a protective undergarments midnight run. Traffic too light, like fishing in a mud puddle. He decided to rest his thumb, balled his fists in the pockets of his ratty jeans, back bowed to the fierce wind, teeth clenched to keep them from chattering, eyes toward oncoming headlights. Except there weren't any. Was everyone in this town under a curfew? An empty soda can clanked behind him, startling him as it skipped across the asphalt. He cursed under his breath. Soon time to unfold the bedroll. Sandy and Tina. Sexy Sandy and kinky Tina. Boy, that was some ride. He smiled. Well, 2 rides, technically. Where the hell had that been? Memphis? No, West Virginia. Almost heaven. His smile evaporated as he smelled something foul. He tripped over some potent roadkill before, but even on the long desert trips out west, where the sun baked the hell out of it, it never smelt quite this bad. He looked down at his feet. Though he hadn't felt anything, he sure as hell must have stepped in it. Another step backward, and he suddenly had the sensation of being watched. He whipped around. It was sitting in the middle of the road, silent, a tall black boulder like one of those statues on Easter Island, the wind tearing at tattered bits of it like moss. He stood still, paralyzed, too startled yet to be frightened, only confused. He heard a rustling, and then caught movement in what he'd at first taken to be a rock. It was unfolding, 2 long branches extending to either side, hypnotically. He watched, mesmerized, for the full 20 seconds it took for the branches to rise, and then suddenly it occurred to him that those weren't branches, they were arms. And as if in response to his realization, the creature began to unfold itself all at once. It stood in the silence, arms wide in a welcoming embrace, and then it came after him. He tried to run, but with his first step his legs buckled beneath him. He scrambled forward, roadside grit biting into his palms. He fumbled for his switchblade, heard its tiny click, 4-inch blade wavering in the darkness. The monster towered over him, and Christopher fought hard to process the riot of details, the creak of black knotted muscle, the swell of belly as it took its breath, forest of rank hair between its legs. The monster leaned down over him. One enormous hand came forward to gently touch his chest, dragging clawed fingertips down, then even more gently touching there in the crook of his jeans. The hand closed carefully, fingers halfway up his back again on the other side, as it cupped him from beneath. The monster laughed, and Christopher Perry felt the vast rumble of the sound in his testicles. The monster's head moved in close, pressed hard lips against his brow. He smelled the blast of its breath over him. He realized that this was a kiss, but then the kiss changed as the grip between his legs began to tighten like a clamp. Another hand closed on his shoulder, and he was suddenly hoisted in the air. A moment passed before he realized the monster was rising with him, the street falling away like a dark ribbon, details of the town blinking out with a dizzying height. The hard lips peeled back, and he felt only teeth against his brow, teeth opening wide to accommodate him. And it's that time once again. Coffee.